I started getting into photogrammetry just over a year ago. I started photo scanning the legendary PS1, which there's actually a video on the YouTube channel. And I've also done it to an epigraphy relic, which you can also check it out in my art station. But now I wanted to step up the game, so I went ahead and photo scanned a whole architectural building. I picked up a Sony Alpha 600 camera, and on a cloudy day, which it's very important that the day is cloudy so the texture is rendered correct, I took over 300 pictures, which at the end I only ended up using 232. Then in reality capture, I ended up with three models when I imported all of these images. Why three? Well, because the program just didn't capture all of the objects as one. So I had to kind of put them together and try to align them however I could. So I just left it in three separate pieces. The three models together ended up with a total of 11.5 million triangles, each with its own 8K texture. I could have exported these models with 16K textures, especially considering the size of these assets. So for the next time I will do it, but for this time I think it was fine because it just had so much fidelity, the mesh, and so many triangles that it kind of saved the texture. And also there wasn't enough budget to rent a drone or buy one, so the scan had no roof. That kind of resulted in the issue that the images didn't align properly, but it is what it is, so let's continue. Before we continue, actually, very important pro tip is clean up all of your geometry in reality capture. Otherwise, it's going to take ages to clean up in Unreal Engine, especially these assets that have millions of triangles. So yeah, just remember, clean up your geometry in reality capture. But still, I also use the modeling tools to clean up the geometry and fix some issues and some roof tile issues. So yeah, the modeling tool was just great. Exporting the models cost me a total of $4.5, so I think it was totally worth it, especially considering that it would have taken me weeks to model and texture this church. So the next step was building the environment. So I went ahead and I imported the Ermita into Unreal Engine and started building the environment. The first step was to fill the gaps. So I covered the whole roof with Megascan roof tiles, and I also fixed some texture issues. Then I tried out the electronic dream sample and the PCG for forest generation, and it was great. So I decided to go all in and sculpt the landscape. I sculpted the landscape in a way where there were three different levels of height, giving that sense of depth. I also added some mountains. I added them manually, but also I just dragged and dropped a level containing multiple mountains, so I didn't spend a lot of time dragging and dropping mountains. Then I used the PCG volume, which is a great tool to procedurally generate foliage. So I generated forest-like foliage on the further shots of my scene. I also used spline paths to generate paths. These paths were absolutely great because it allowed me to generate super realistic procedural paths and also allowed me to delete the hornbeam assets that I didn't want there to be in the path. So the end result ended up like this. And of course, let's not forget to add more foliage because otherwise the scene will just look flat. So I carefully added foliage on the areas that I knew the cameras were going to be. And it just made the scene look much more alive. Before I forget, you can type down this command down, and what's going to do is it's going to force your photons to scatter through the leaves, making the scene look more realistic. So this is how it looks off, and this is how it looks on. Now it was time to set up the camera sequences and focusing on more the aesthetics of the scene. So I had multiple sequences using one same camera with different focal settings, positions, and also different camera shakes. In total, I had 3 camera shakes for different camera positions to give that sense of realism in the scene. I also added some subtle animations on assets, for example, on this cube, on this vine, on top of the church, and also on the chain, which I tried adding physics to it, but it was too complicated to render it. And last but not least, I used something that I called magic cubes. These magic cubes are basically huge black cubes that block light photons from going through, and this adds a lot of contrast in the renders, so I think it was great. I kind of abused them a bit, but if it turns out well, then hey, why not? Now it was time for the rendering, so time to render, folks. I rendered at EXR format with no aces, no motion blur, some console variables, 12 anti-aliasing samples, and 4K resolution export setting. All these 6 sequences took about 2 hours to render, taking into consideration my 2060 series. Then for the final touches, imported into Davinci Resolve, added some Catalan music in the background, carefully selected sound effects to bring the scene to life. You can also modify the channel in which the audio is emitted, either the right ear or the left one or both. So for the birds, I chose the left side. And then I used William Fauscher's video to color grade. So yeah, let me know how to quickly paste the color grading settings from one sequence to another. But yeah, this was the end result. Let me know what you think. Do you like it more without grading or with grading? Now we reach the rendering issues. So I ran into 2 rendering issues. One being the particles and 2 being the foliage. The particles were for some reason despawning in the middle of the renders. So what I had to do is go to the anti-aliasing settings and change the warm-up from 32 seconds down to 0. Also, I had to go to the lifetime of the particles and change it up to 5,000 seconds because the default value for the seconds are not enough. And in theory, in each sequence, the cycle should restart for the particles, but for some reason it didn't here. So yeah, I just made sure to increase the lifetime of the particles. The second issue was the wind. I made actually a post on the Unreal community. If someone can help me out, please help me because I don't quite understand how the wind works. It seems like the wind in the viewport is strong and I can modify those values, but then in game the wind gets reduced a lot, especially for trees, not for grass as much, but for trees the wind gets reduced a lot. So help me out finding out why there is wind in the viewport and not in the gameplay or the render. And that's basically a wrap up of the workflow that I've taken into making this Ermita environment. The next step is seeing if it runs in virtual reality using DLSS. So I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.